Bem-vindos nesta mesa número 16, o grande romance americano, com Marlon James e Paul Beatty. Marlon é jamaicano, nascido em Kingston, mas desde o ano 2007 mora em Minnesota, nos Estados Unidos, onde é professor de escrita criativa e literatura. Ele é autor de 3 romances. O mais recente deles, Breve História de 7 Assassinatos, mereceu o prêmio Man Booker no ano 2015. O livro está sendo lançado no Brasil pela Intrínseca, na tradução de André Charnobai. Numa resenha, o New York Times descreveu assim o livro: é como um remake do filme Balada Sangrenta, feito por Tarantino, com trilha sonora do Bob Marley, e roteiro de Oliver Stone e William Faulkner. Então, welcome, Marlon.
Thank you.
Paul Beatty nasceu em Los Angeles, na Califórnia, mas hoje mora em Nova York, onde é professor de escrita criativa na Universidade de Columbia. Ele se formou em psicologia antes de virar escritor. Começou a vida de autor como poeta. Ele fazia parte da turma de slams de poesia do New York Poets Café. Editou um livro chamado Hokum, uma antologia do humor afro-americano. E já publicou 4 romances. O Vendido, o mais recente, foi lançado em 2016 e mereceu também o prêmio Man Booker, a primeira vez que um americano ganhava o prêmio. Está sendo lançado no Brasil pela editora Todavia, na tradução do Rogério Galindo. O livro foi chamado pela crítica de obra maestra cômica e o próprio Paul tem sido descrito como o autor mais engraçado dos Estados Unidos. So, welcome, Paul.
No, thank you.
So let's get right down to it. Is the sound okay? Can you?
Hear ya? Yeah.
Okay, so far so good. So, Marlon, Brief History of 7 Killings is a novel with over 70 characters. About 15 of them are narrators. It involves CIA agents, gangsters, music journalists, moves from Jamaica in the 70s to the US in the 80s. My question is, what were you thinking?
Oh God, I don't think I was thinking at all. That's the problem. Because I actually set out to write my shortest novel. I was reading all these crime novels. I was reading lots of Jim Thompson and Jean-Patrick Manchet and Jean-Claude Izzo and I really wanted to write this great crime novel. So I don't know where it is in the Portuguese version of the book, but the very first chapter I wrote is now on page 458 in the English version, which should tell you that I had no idea what I was doing when I was writing. Even the Bob Marley element came in later. I kept trying to write these novellas, and I kept failing writing them. And I remember I was having dinner with my friend Rachel, and I said, I don't know whose story this is. Yeah. And she said, why do you think it's one person's story? When last have you read Faulkner's As I Lay Dying? So I went back and read that, and it was that big eureka moment. Because when you're telling a story about somewhere like Jamaica, it just can't be one person's story. You know, the second I saw a movie like The City of God, I understood why there are so many characters. Because one character just can't tell the story of this place. And that's how it kind of happened. It just came out of necessity. I also had 7 characters I had to kill off, and it took them 30 years to kill them. So
And as you explained, the plot revolves around the attempted assassination of Bob Marley in 1976. And curiously enough, he's the one character that doesn't have a voice. So we hear from people around him. You don't even mention him by name.
Right.
He's always referred to as the musician. Why did you make that choice?
Well, you know, I was 2 things, I think, that became the deciding factor in that. One is I wanted the Bob Marley I knew, which is somebody I didn't know at all. Bob Marley was already an icon. He was a figure. He was not somebody I ever saw. You know, I don't know what Bob Marley smelled like. So he even then was an icon. Bob Marley to me was a series of news reports. Even his treatment for cancer and the hope, because somebody did a skin graft, and you can't really use a skin graft to get rid of melanoma. That's not how it works. But just the drama of him fighting cancer and losing it was all through a series of news reports, and that's the Marley I wanted to keep. I also was reading this essay by Gaetalese called "Frank Sinatra Has a Cold," and if you've never come across this essay, Gaetalese went to, I can't remember where, it may have been Miami, I can't remember, to interview Sinatra, and Sinatra would not talk to him. The excuse was, Mr. Sinatra has a cold. And almost accidentally, he revolutionized his journalism by just interviewing everybody around him. And, you know, and that always attracted me, the sort of, who are the people hovering around? I remember once I saw a photo of a basketball player giving a dunk, and I want to know, who's the loser who let that thing pass? And I've always been interested by people who sort of go off into the background, because history books aren't going to cover them. You know, Marley's taken care of. He has like 15 biographies. He doesn't need me.
And you've said that you're also sort of attempting to understand that decade that you lived through.
Right.
But, I mean, you had sort of a pretty conventional sort of middle-class upbringing. So you were quite removed from many of these things that you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, removed and sort of not removed. Both of my parents were police. You know, my mom was a detective. My father was a beat cop who quit after a while to become a lawyer. So it's, you know, my house would be pretty stable, but then my mom would come with some warning. Don't go in that neighborhood next week. And we're like, what? What are you talking about? Of course, there'd be a big shootout the following week. So there was that. But, you know, it's the thing about a country like Jamaica is, on one hand, there are 10 different Jamaicas. On the other hand, it's still a pretty small country. So something that's happening in West Kingston, it's still going to reverberate in, you know, in the rest of the country. So I didn't feel as if I was safe, necessarily. I felt safe because my parents were badasses. But other than that, I didn't really, you know, you didn't get the sense, or put it this way, in Jamaica you had a sense that we're all in it together, for better or worse.
Yeah. You're going to read a fragment from the book to give us a taste.
Yeah.
Could you set the scene for us?
Sure. So this is the second character I actually wrote. His name is Bam Bam, and he's 14 years old, and he's already been indoctrinated into one of the baddest gangs in Jamaica. And he came from a really, really, really horrendous upbringing. And this sort of ties into it. So he's already pretty bitter, pretty violent. All he was waiting for was a gun. And the character Joseph Wills gave it to him. So this is him. He's one of the 7 who tried to kill Marley. There are 8 actually, but Brief History of 8 Killings wasn't a sexy title. The 8th one actually went and begged Marley forgiveness, and he forgave him. But then as soon as Marley died, he vanished. So I might write a sequel, you never know. So this is Bam Bam. I know I was 14, that me know. I also know that too many people talk too much, especially the American who never shut up. Just switch to a laugh every time he talk about you. And it's something strange about how he put your name beside people you never hear. About Allende and Lumumba, a name that sounds like a country that Kunta Kinte come from. The American, most of the time, hide him eye with sunglasses like he's a preacher from America come to talk to black people. Him and the Cuban come sometimes together, sometimes on their own. And when one talk, the other always quiet. The Cuban don't fuck with guns because guns always need to be needed, him say. And I know I used to sleep on a cot, and I know that my mother was a whore, and my father was the last good man in the ghetto. And I know we watched your big house on Hope Road for days now, and at one point, you come talk to us like you was Jesus and we was Iscariot, and you nod as if to say, get on with your business and do what you have to do. But I can't remember if me see you, or if somebody told me that him see you, so that me think I see you too. You stepping out on the back porch, eating a slice of breadfruit. She coming out of nowhere like she have a serious business outside of at that time of night, and shocked, so shocked that you don't have no clothes on. And then she reached for your fruit because she wanted to eat it, even though Rasta don't like when women loose. And you both get to midnight raving, and I grab myself and rave too, for either seeing it or hearing it, and then you write a song about it. The boy from Concrete Jungle on the same girly green scooter come by for 4 days at 8 in the morning and 4 in the evening for that brown envelope, until the new security guards start to turn him back. We know about that business too. In the 8 lanes and in Copenhagen City, all you can do is watch. Sweet-talking voice on the radio say that crime and violence are taking over the country, and if change ever going to come, then we'll have to wait and see. But all we can do down here in the 8 lanes is see and wait. And I see shit water run free down the street, and I wait. And I see my mother take 2 men for $20 each, and 1 more who paid $25 to stay in instead of pull out, and I wait. And I watch my father get so sick and tired of her that he beat her like a dog. And I see the zinc on the roof rust itself brown, and then the rain batter holes into it like foreign cheese. And I see 7 people in 1 room and 1 pregnant, and people fucking anyway, because people so poor, they can't even afford shame. And I wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Many of the characters, the Jamaican characters, speak in the patois.
Right.
How did you manage that difference in register, knowing that your audience would be, you know, all over the English-speaking world?
Yeah. You know, it's something at some point I just had to stop thinking about it. Because in Jamaica, there are lots of different patois. Most Jamaicans think I went to college abroad because I talk like this. And I go, I talk like this from I was 5. Yeah, that's what you get when you watch too much TV. So I also wanted to capture that in the book. So Nina Burgess speaks patois, and Josie Wales speaks patois, and Bam Bam speaks patois, but it's not the same because of all the different reasons, class, geography, whatever. The other thing that's in the book is everybody has this obsession with good speech. So everybody keeps saying, that person talks bad, that person chat bad, even though they all chat bad. But also, you know, I think the whole idea of standard English is kind of a joke. I don't think there's any such thing as standard English. I think British people think they have standard English, but British English is terrible English. It's, if we're up to that, with English language would have been dead by 1950. It's, so I wanted that, the characters to sound, I wanted the voice that sometimes comes out of my own mouth to be the voice that comes out of literature. And that was something that my generation and few older are doing, but we always were taught that that was something to laugh at. That is something you use for slapstick comedy. That's not the voice of serious literature. And if it wasn't for the reggae musicians speaking in patois, but talking about serious things, people like me wouldn't have thought then, oh, I can use it.
Thank you very much. Paul, I want to ask you now to tell us a little bit about The Sellout. So the central conceit of the novel is that there is a black man sitting in front of the Supreme Court, put on trial for trying to reinstate segregation and slavery. Where did that come from?
I don't know. I don't know. That came. I don't know about later, but for me, the book. I don't know. Marlon said something interesting about like the reason you had all these characters was to try to tell a complete story.
Yeah.
And I don't have like his guts, so I just try to tell a very narrow story, you know, about a big place. And so I don't know. When you said the central conceit, I think the central conceit is, I wish I knew how to surf, you know? So it's like a book about trying to find an excuse to surf. But for me, the book started with the hominy character, you know?
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about, really. He's a composite of myself, a guy who used to live on a block that I grew up on in Los Angeles, a guy named Eddie Smith, who was a stuntman. and would always promise to put us in the movies. He's a composite of a litany of African-American male minstrels, comedians, from, silent movies until now. And he's I don't know, I just, I went to there's an old movie star named Stepin Fetchit. Mm-hmm. You know Stepin Fetchit?
Nope, Stepin Fetchit, no.
Yeah. He's, the quintessential coon. And, he's the figure of ridicule, of Hollywood ridicule. And I went to see a writer who I admire a lot. His name is Amiri Baraka. And he was talking about Stepin Fetchit. And he would say, so in the movies they would say, Stepin Fetchit, go fetch that pail of water. And, it'd be 20 feet away, but it would take him 20 minutes to go get the pail of water, moving really slow. He'd talk really slow. And Amiri said, only the most servile, docile, really complete sellout runs to get the pail of water. Mm-hmm. There's a reason. There's these other, I thought that was a really interesting reading on that. And so, the Little Rascals are a big part of that book, which I know no one knows, but for me and my...
Everyone knows Little Rascals.
You think so?
Of course.
I don't know about
you guys know Little Rascals?
Some people do.
Rascals.
Yeah.
But it was like a real,
you may have to explain Little Rascals.
Yeah, it was just a show of these street urchins, that, I guess started in the late 20s and lasted until a little bit after World War II.
So it would show them before films, that kind of thing, no?
Before?
Films, before movies.
No, they were movies.
Yeah, no, but they would show them before features.
Oh, yeah. So back in the day, they would show them before movies, but, I grew up watching them, coming home after school, and it would be on television. Yep. And so a lot of those episodes were shot in my neighborhood or near my neighborhood, so me and my friends had a weird attraction to it for that reason. But, I don't know how to talk about it, really. But, he's, this character Buckwheat in The Little Rascals was such a iconographic, again, like Stepin Fetchit, mm-hmm. this iconographic representation of black maleness that just never went away. It still hasn't gone away.
No.
And so, and in The Little Rascals, because it's always kids, so kids would age out of the gang. So there was always like a black male who was like a very central figure in the show. They would age out. But his replacement was always in there, so the one kid's 10 and then the other kid's 5. And then he'd be the new person. So for me it was interesting, who was going to be the next Buckwheat, but when the racial climate changed, who was that person? What was the career that they missed out on? And how would they be? So this Buckwheat's understudy was the phrase that stuck in my head. And it was just interesting for me to tease out what that would be. And then all the rest of the concepts, most of them just came out of that, I think.
But so that was the origin of the hominy character.
Yeah.
But what about the narrator, who is sort of, he's been put through all sorts of social experiments by his father, you know, to sort of condition him. So this is what sort of black experience is like, et cetera, et cetera. So where did that come from?
It just comes from all the constant sloganeering, the constant everybody telling you how to be, who to be, what to be all the time. You know. And before I started writing, I was getting my doctorate in psychology. And psych is always a big part of just how I see the world and how I write to a large extent. And this is for whatever reason, I wanted to make that a very topical part of the book. And it's something I usually do more subtly, but and it was just that idea of how does somebody raise somebody theoretically, what would that look like, you know? It's just I tend to come up with these brave characters who just try to do the impossible, and futilely, of course.
Bring back segregation.
Yeah, but that's not the aim. He's trying to bring back a town that's been erased off the map. Is what he's really trying to do. he's really just trying to spend his time. You know, he's trying to. It's California, you know, not much happens. So, yeah.
Almost every single review of your book uses the word satire. And I know that you're not very comfortable with being described as a satirical writer. Why is that?
I don't know. Whenever I think of a satirist, I think of Mark Twain, you know, post his writing career, making these whistle stops and having to be funny and, you know, having a shtick. And I'm trying to avoid that. I think that's, you know, on a personal level. And then I just think that it's a very lazy word, you know, because it can mean anything. And you don't have to really tackle anything by saying something satire. And I was in London, and I was in Hackney, this neighborhood called Hackney, and a woman went, "This is not satire, this is real life," you know? And so for me, it's also interesting about, you know, one reviewer will say it's a satire of X, another reviewer will say it's a satire of Y, you know? So it's, I don't know, it's just it's a word that I think people can hide behind without really having to say anything. So I try not to do that.
But it's undoubtedly funny.
Yeah, comic novel doesn't bother me at all.
A comic novel doesn't bother you.
No.
And what does that sort of comedic effect allow you to do as a writer that you can't achieve?
I don't know. I don't write to try to be funny. It's just how I've always written. You know, I don't consider myself like a joke teller or anything like that. But I think, you know, a part of the humor is in the perspective that the characters take on the world, not so much in this is a funny, you know, I mean, there's some of that. But it's just, yeah, it's just how I am, I guess. It's just how I write. Like, you know, I'd been writing poetry for a long time, and I never even really thought about being funny. And then somebody went, "Is everything that you write always so funny?" And I went, "Oh." You know, I had to really think about what I was doing, you know. And then I just try not to think about it, because that's another task I don't want to take on, is having to be funny, you know. So,
will you read from the book for us?
Sure.
And this is the very opening pages.
This may be hard to believe coming from a black man, but I've never stolen anything. Never cheated on my taxes or at cards. Never snuck into the movies or failed to give back the extra change to a drugstore cashier, indifferent to the ways of mercantilism and minimum wage expectations. I've never burgled a house, held up a liquor store. Never boarded a crowded bus or subway car, sat in a seat reserved for the elderly, pulled out my gigantic penis, and masturbated to satisfaction with a perverted yet somehow crestfallen look on my face. But here I am in the cavernous chambers of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, my car illegally and somewhat ironically parked on Constitution Avenue, my hands cuffed and crossed behind my back, my right to remain silent long since waived and said goodbye to, as I sit in a thickly padded chair that, much like this country, isn't quite as comfortable as it looks. Is it all right if I stop there?
That's fine. Yeah, thank you. To me, it's that very last sentence you read, which explains a lot of the book. You know, the chair that, much like the US, isn't quite as comfortable as it looks.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's a little bit like what we were talking about with humor. It's like, you know, I'll read a passage in the book, and people will be laughing their asses off, you know, and then I'll be somewhere else, and I'll read the same passages, and people are still engaged, but going, yeah, this shit ain't that funny. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
but they're engaged, and it's my mood, you know, there's so many things. And so, you know, and that aspect of writing, of life, is just always really fascinating to me, you know? You know, like a phrase I always use, it's the same but different. You know, I never know how to categorize things. And I think, you know, that idea, and it's like it's sort of a concept that you get from psychology. It's like what you see, often what you think you feel isn't the case, you know? And that's, for me, interesting to play with. Yeah.
I mean, as a reader, I found I was laughing out loud at bits, and then feeling incredibly awkward and uncomfortable, and asking myself, you know, should I be laughing about this? So, I mean, I guess that's sort of a similar reaction to what most readers will have experienced.
Yeah, I guess. I can't speak to most readers. I know, yeah, I mean, I feel like that in life all the time. So, yeah, I laugh at the wrong time all the time. But, yeah.
I mean, Marlon, you do some of that in sort of pushing the boundaries of, you know, what should be, you know, sort of acceptable, the kinds of things that people should say or shouldn't say, and you're sort of constantly pushing.
I think it's really more the characters. You know, two characters, Josie Wales and Nina Burgess, are very big on identifying hypocrisy. And when you're in a country like Jamaica, there's tons of hypocrisy to go around. It's you know, everything from how white Americans dance, you know, to the different class systems in Jamaica. And also, I think in Jamaica, you always have this idea that if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So you just end up laughing at the ridiculousness of a lot of what is, you know, a lot of what is going on. But I was also in that book interested in people pushed into corners that they have to come out fighting from. People left with no other choice. Because again, you know, my 70s, in 1976, my biggest crisis was, do I like you know, Farrah Fawcett or Jacqueline Smith in Charlie's Angels? You know,
Kate Jackson, man, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, but she's
Jacqueline Smith every time.
She was like the best friend. You like, she got you. But she wasn't.
That was Kate Jackson.
So, but the 70s I went through, even, you know, when you're 6 years old, any world is a world of wonder. And I was very curious about the world that happened that I had little idea about. And it struck me just how dangerous it was, how volatile it was, the things people were doing, the choices people were making. And, you know, I've never shied away from writing people doing really horrible things to people. You know, as long as, I always say violence should be violent. You know, if you know, if I'm trying to think of somebody doing action movies now, you know, if Robert Downey Jr. shows up, you know he's not going to die. You know that Tom Cruise is not going to die. He's also going to have lots of sex. But to be in a situation where all bets are off, and to recognize that was something that I really wanted to sort of go for in that book. And that does mean, I mean, a lot of boundary pushing, because people are doing things that they wouldn't normally, do.
And you pretty much sort of explode the notion that you can get a handle on Jamaica. I mean, there's one of the wonderful characters, Alex Pierce, who's sort of a Rolling Stone journalist, going down to Jamaica to report on this big peace concert. And at some point he says to someone else, I know the real Jamaica. And the other person says, well, you know, good for you. I've lived here all my life and haven't found the real Jamaica yet. Yeah. So it's only the outsiders who think they get it.
That's something I got all the time. You know, I remember, so I used to be Sean Paul's art director. And Sean is an upper middle class kid, and without the doubt, Vibe magazine, Rolling Stone, all of them will come and go, we want to shoot his origins. So then we take him to the 3-story house with a dog and a pool. They're like, can we see the real Jamaica? And we're like, what do you mean, poor Jamaica? Yeah, it's real, but this kind of sort of third world porn that these journalists have. And Alex is one of these guys who's trying so hard not to be the cliche that he ends up being the cliche. Because in the book, he's the one person who sees everything and doesn't understand what the hell is going on. But he's obsessed with that. I'm not like those white guys at the party doing a limbo and saying things like Jamaican me crazy. He's real, but he's not. He's also not a good writer.
I mean, he's trying to write a piece and kind of saying, you know, don't be Hunter Thompson, don't be Hunter Thompson, which sort of raised a question in my head, whether there are any writers, this is a question for both of you, are there any writers you try not to be? Everyone always asks, what
Who I
writer?
try not to be?
What a lot of people ask, what writer most influenced you, right?
Yeah.
But going back to this guy saying, don't be Hunter Thompson. So are there any writers you try to avoid as role models?
The one writer I try not to be is Cormac McCarthy. Because my Cormac McCarthy phase was awful. It was, I would write things like, he came to the door and opened the door and went through the door and closed the door and sat down. Which sounds like genius when Cormac McCarthy does it. It sounds like I'm writing a love letter at 13 when I write it. He was a horrible influence on me. He's a fantastic writer, but he was a terrible, terrible influence. So I try not to even read him when I'm writing, because I'm going to write sentences like that.
Yeah. Paul, what about you?
I don't really have anybody that I haven't tried not to be. I think, so I've never read Catcher in the Rye, but I think lifestyle-wise, I have to make a real effort to try not to be J.D. Salinger, because I think that's my tendency, is to try. My wife is laughing at me because she knows it's true. So, I mean, stylistically, I don't really think about it like that way, but yeah.
One of the characters in The Sellout has this thing he's trying to do, which is he's trying to rewrite all the American classics, including Salinger, into this black register. So that sounds like sort of a fun project to just to invent the titles for all these things.
Yeah, it's not so much into a black register; it's into this this humanist register, I think. And yeah, I mean, somebody really did this. They wrote like this, I guess for lack of a better phrase, politically correct version of Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine wrote like a piece defending that. You know, he was talking about, yeah, I love that book, you know, but when I read it to my kids, I have a hard time because the word nigger is in it, and you know, and I went, yeah, the beautiful thing for me, I don't have any kids, so it's easy for me to say, but it's part of that is to talk about why you love that book in spite of this. You know, that's the real story.
Yeah.
You know, and so that effort, I understand the motivation a little bit, but I don't really get it. Yeah. But yeah.
That sounds like me when I try to come to terms with writers like Knut Hansen, who I really like, but he was such a Nazi, he gave his medal to, I think, Goebbels. You know, or Flannery O'Connor, you know, writers, or Dickens, because you know, Dickens is a huge influence on me, and Dickens is a particularly sour point even for Jamaica, because you know, when we had one of the worst suppressions of a demonstration in history, they killed like 400 people, and the governor was being charged, and Dickens was the person who came out and defended him. So even as a Jamaican interested in my own history, he's kind of a son of a bitch. But at the same time, I mean, few writers have had such a big influence on how I structure a book. So, and I think you know, as a reader, you have to come to terms with things like that all the time. Is you know, what do you do with these books? What do you do with these? What do you do with these writers? Some writers, I go, you know what? There's so many books, I don't have to read Jack London. But I can't claim any sort of superiority because I have Flannery O'Connor in my house. I think it also just depends on what kind of I guess stuff you can put up with.
I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, Marlon is, you know, people are so uncomfortable. I can say Americans, I won't say everyone, but are so uncomfortable with contradiction. And like but it's just a fact. It's just always there, you know? And then we point at these things and we say, well, that's a contradiction, that's hypocrisy, hence your argument's invalid, you know, all this kind of stuff. And you were talking, and I was thinking about, like, it's something I'm aware of, but it's something that doesn't really bother me. And I think about, I grew up in Santa Monica. My best friend was this kid, David Eisenstadt, Jewish kid. And we were both the biggest Nazi fans, you know? And it's so important to how I developed as a writer, just as a thinker. And his dad, like, indulged us in that, you know? So we, you know, when we built all these World War II models, we never built, like, any American stuff. It was always Messerschmitts and Stuka dive bombers and, you know, Panzer tanks. And his father would take us to these, you know, World War II. Back then in California, there was a huge aerospace industry, so there were a lot of old planes around, you know, and I mean, we were obsessed, you know. And no one ever told us, like, this is a contradiction, you can't do this because they've done this. You know, we knew what the Nazis were about, you know, we read all these books. But it fed us, it kept us thinking, kept us going, you know. And it just gave us this weird perspective somehow. And there's a part of that, I talk about him all the time, you know, because that was so fundamental to me. And I was fortunate enough that no one, like, you know, Catholic school slapped a ruler on my hand, you know.
Yeah. Both novels are incredibly dense in sort of detail, you have sort of period detail, sort of local color, if you wish, and facts, historical facts. And so I want to ask you both about the research that goes into your novels.
You know, I spend, I mean, I can give the example of the novel I'm writing now. I just spent 2 years researching it. By that I mean I have students research for me for extra credit.
One of the advantages of being a professor.
You know, because when I start writing, I just write straight to the end. And if I'm going to do that, I need some sort of authority when I'm writing. I just need to know. I don't learn everything, but I need to know enough so I can just keep writing. And if I'm researching it, it sort of comes in. But I also like reading the boring stuff. I want to read if I find a really good book, I go to the bibliography and find what they read. So I'll read the tax records, I'll read the ship logs and all of that stuff. Because I think there are aspects of fiction that history doesn't care about that I think makes fiction more real. Like, I want to know if underwear in 19th century itch. Because then I can just have my character scratching his ass the whole scene. And I want to know these things. I want to know what they ate. I want to know, you know, what they wore. I want to know how they keep their teeth clean. One of the big lies in those Jane Austen novels, in those films, is everybody rich always have perfect teeth. That's a total lie. They would all have horrible teeth if they have any. So like, you know, it's like Heathcliff shows up with Heathcliff's breath. You don't want to be near Heathcliff. But I want to know those things. I want to know as much as I can so that I feel like I'm almost like a journalist for imagined people. When I get in and start writing. Even the book I'm writing now, which is, you know, it's fantasy, it's most part made up, it still involves a ton of research. It still took me 2 years.
I mean, in your sort of acknowledgements, you mentioned, for instance, someone who corrected you on the particular route from, you know, the airport.
Oh yeah, from JFK to the Bronx.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
well, I got it wrong. I had to correct it.
Would it have made a difference if that were factually inaccurate?
I think it would have made a difference to me. You know, ultimately, fine, it's not that big a scene. And you're going to have the one nerd who go, actually, that's not the way to the Bronx, and blah, blah, blah. But it's not even necessarily that I'm interested in authenticity. I just like being in the moment as much as I possibly can. And that's why, you know, I would think of stuff like that. But it didn't occur to me as my first draft reader was like, dude, you know, this is not the route from the airport. And so, I want stuff like that in there. I remember my previous book, I had this great shootout scene. I was so proud of it. It was this badass female bank robber. It was British soldiers, and she had 2 guns, and she was just kicking it. And then I went back and realized the 6-shooter wasn't invented yet. And that whole scene have to go. I cried the whole day because that was such a good scene. But a gun wasn't invented yet, so it had to go.
Paul, what's your take on research and writing fiction?
Yeah, I mean, that book was a lot of research. I mean, I don't know if I said it earlier, but, you know, that's the fun bit of it. It's, you know, being lost, you know? Yeah, I don't know where to start with this, but, you know, when I was thinking about this book, I was at this little retreat thing, and Rebecca Solnit was talking about a book that she hadn't written, which was about mapping San Francisco. And she was talking, and it just hit me what my book was about, which is mapping LA. Like, how do you navigate LA? So and there's so many ways. So part of this that took me a long time, and I love what you said about like you wanted it to be right. Like I'm not so much concerned with wanting it to be factually right, but I want it to feel right for what it is, because it's all a fucking lie anyway, right? So, but the things I wanted to be right. So I wanted to use these bus lines, even though I'm making up the neighborhoods and some of the streets, but there was something about these bus lines. And then so, because that was important to me about how I navigated LA as a kid, you know, and the distinction between who takes the bus, who does, all these other little things. And so people, like the question that I hate and like at the same time, if somebody comes up to me and goes, oh, so where do you surf, blah, 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 because for them the surfing bits read authentic. Whereas for somebody else, I'm like, this motherfucker's never surfed a day in his life. But you know, I don't know. But for me, it's like memory of my friends that surf. You know, for me, it's the reasons why I don't surf, because I wasn't getting up at 5:30 in the morning to take the bus down there. I just wasn't doing it. So, you know, so there's a ton of stuff. And so this neighborhood, this neighborhood, The Farms, is based on a real neighborhood in a town called Compton in California. And so my sister works in that town, and one of my best friends is a principal of a school in that town. And I was just driving through there, and I saw these two guys on horseback in what's, you know, supposedly the inner city of California. And I went, oh my God, I forgot that people rode horses, you know? But then it took me back to, when do I see horses in California, you know, in my life? I've seen them in Compton, I've seen them in Palisades. So, you know, but again, that's not research, but I had to go back and go, so how do it was one of the hardest things to do in the book, is how do I make this neighborhood fantastical and believable and authentic and absurd all at the same time. And that just took a lot of research to just kind of, not to figure out what the place is, but just how people talk about the place. It took a long time. That's what I'm trying to say.
And I guess what really makes it come to life is that there is some sort of inner consistency to that. So, you know, things sort of chime and sound authentic because as you know, as a whole, it sounds real.
But I mean, you know, the great thing about research is that it actually allowed me to invent. That was the great thing about it. You know, there is no Copenhagen City in Jamaica. There's no 8 lanes. But it was a research of how people fight over territory and so on that made me create these kind of mythical cities. You know, one of the funny things about that book is that a lot of the really crazy stuff is stuff that actually happened. You know, we have one of the characters in the book is based on a notorious gunman who everybody knew was gay. But you, of course, didn't see, because his way of doing it was, when he finally captures you, you and him in a room, he says, you know, let's have oral sex and I'll save your life. Of course, you want to save your life, so you get down and you get to work, and then he shoots you in the head. And then the way he ended up in prison was that they found his DNA in the victim's mouth. And then the weirdest part, the absolute weirdest part, is that he had a press conference. Not to say he was guilty, he totally killed him, but that he was straight. So he has this huge press conference talking about, I have 40 girlfriends, I have 200 children, I do not know how my DNA got into that man's mouth. I'm like, dude, we all know. But research leads to those kind of crazy things that can really sort of enrich a novel.
Yeah, it just leads to the thing you didn't even know you were looking for.
Right.
You know, it's just, oh, I didn't know I was looking for that. And it's not like what's there, but it just sparks something else.
Yeah, it sparks something else, and you have one of those, the book is writing you moment. Because you're just like, we got to go with this.
Do you need this?
No, I'm used to it. You know, I just do this.
A question for both of you. How do you cope with the expectation that you will be writing about sort of issues that concern black authors only, or, you know, Jamaican authors only? Do you feel that, you know, you have to explain Jamaica to others, and do you feel that that's something you want to sort of get away from? Does
I like
it
how
bother
you're looking
you?
Straight at me. I don't. Honestly, I don't. I do feel, you know, because there's a Jamaica I'm interested in writing about, and I've written 3 novels, and it's 3 different Jamaicas, and the Jamaicas I'm interested in writing about. I've never, I don't think, you know, you can't write by committee when you're writing a novel, and you can't write by expectations. There'll always be somebody who's disappointed. You know, the day after the Booker Prize, you know, it was a headline in Jamaican newspaper, and the person was like, "We're really proud, but the book is too long, and it's too violent, and it's painting the wrong picture of Jamaica." Yeah. I was like, you know, I don't work for the tourist board. You know, it's not my job to present wonderful beaches and beautiful people. At the same time, I'm not interested in this sort of violence or pornography either. So I'm not interested in demonizing the country either. But in terms of, you know, I know for me, and it's funny, I was on a panel with Salman Rushdie, and we talked about this, how we still feel this expectation. He feels this expectation to be an Indian writer. And I feel this expectation to be a Jamaican writer or a diaspora writer, and I can't write fantasy. I can't do a superhero comic. And if it's a superhero comic, it must be a black character. Well, when it can be, who cares? But it took me a while, for example, to accept that I could write the novel that I'm writing, because there's still this sort of, the things that are expected of a third world, person of color, living in America, gay writer. And you can't have to like just screw all of that. Because once, you know, you can't bring any of that to the page, because it will show.
Paul, what about you? I mean, do you have a sense that people expect you to write as a black author? And is that something that you bristle from? Or?
No, I don't really have that sense, really. I mean, I think, yeah, it's none of it's universal. Everything's as non-universal as everything else, you know, and I figured that out really early on, you know, and I think that's what, so there's like one question that's always like, that I've gotten is, people will ask me, could somebody not black have written your book? And I'm like, I'm the only fucker alive who could have written that book, hopefully. That's what I'm trying to do, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so that's someone else's problem. You don't have to deal with it at some level, but it's someone else's problem, and I think what makes anything good is that it defies expectation, right? You know, who wants to go see something that, you know, well, I mean, I guess people do want that, but, right. You know, that's not something I'm trying to do. So, yeah, I mean, that's out there, and I just, it's not like I never think about it or anything, but it's, in some ways, I write about that sense of expectation, you know? I mean, it's just fodder, so.
But, and you sort of, I mean, one of the things that comes out of your novel is the fact that, you know, these ideas of sort of race and ethnicity and the issues with sort of racial identity are not unique to black people. There is a very funny scene where, you know, the character's wondering what neighborhood they might move to. And there's a Mexican woman who says, "Oh, don't move there. Too many Mexicans." So, I mean, it is sort of universal.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is. It's, self-pity's universal, I think. So, yeah, I think everything's universal to some extent. It's whether the reader, sometimes the author, allows it to be, you know? Because you can say, this is not universal, this is unique to X, Y, and Z. In some cases, you could be right, I guess. But the process, I think, for me, is, things like vulnerability are universal. I mean, they're just so, hypocrisy, contradiction, all the stuff that we're talking about is universal.
Love, hate, people doing bad things to people. They are. Yes. You know, ultimately, I just don't really think humanity is all that different, honestly. We're still doing the same shit we did 2,000 years ago. And, which doesn't mean I have I kind of have a slightly dim view of humanity, but and I'm not trying to say, I think one of the things, you know, I teach creative writing, and I come across students who are convinced that their life is so generic they have nothing to say. And I said, well, you know, the one thing we all have in common is our experiences are all particular. Even boredom is not the same boredom everywhere. Yeah, even you know, you read a story like Deborah Tall's Here. You know, she talks about endlessly repeatable boredom. And you know, all she says is one house, two trees, one house, two trees, one house, two trees, one house, two trees. And you get it. It's a different. It's an endlessly repeatable boredom. So even in you know in situations like that, it's more the thing that I think we all have in common is that our experiences are so particular. And when you try to be universal, you usually fall into just vagueness.
And I think part of it is like how we're taught to read. Like, so these books are about race, right? These books are about femininity, or these books are about sexuality, or whatever. And it's, you know, it's like the notion to think that white literature hasn't been about race from the start.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's always been about race.
Because it's about perception, you know? And often the books are about what's not in them as much as a part of the book as what's in it, you know? And so I just, you know, at some level for me, it's pretty simple. It's like, you know, I just don't give a fuck about somebody else's expectations. You know, I do at some level because I want the book to be out there and all these other things, but to make the book that I want to make, I have to let that go, at least as best as I can.
This is just sort of a personal observation, but I think maybe in the past literature was a bit more promiscuous. If you read sort of, you know, Mark Twain, he kind of throws everything in there without wondering, you know, is this about race? Is this about women? Is this about children? What is this? And nowadays, and this is maybe sort of the academic straitjacket and the labels we put on things. So now things are about gender or about race.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of that, but I think, you know, to our credit, is people do have bigger voices now. So it's hard to spew that bullshit and not get any blowback.
Yeah.
You know what I
Totally.
mean? So that's another thing to deal with, which doesn't mean you shouldn't spew the bullshit if that's what you want to do. I would never tell you not to.
Yeah.
You know? But so I think that's also part of it. It's not just this, you know, these academic limitations on that. No, I mean, things have changed in some level.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that people keep getting wrong about the whole cultural appropriation thing, especially when it comes to literature. And I know Lionel Shriver said a bunch of things I totally disagree with. It's not, nobody is the right to write whatever you want is a given. The privilege of not being called out on your bullshit is not.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's not necessarily you're fighting for free literary freedom so much as you're bitching about a bad review. So what we're gonna do is get rid of all book reviewers. I don't think I've ever come across a black writer who ever said this person should not write this. But if they write it and fail, the difference is the blowback is quick. The difference is people will call them out on it. And I think that was something that I think a lot of writers took for granted, that they could write about these things and nobody ever questioned it. And you don't get to do that. I don't get to do that. Nobody gets to do that. But it's not, you know, it's not censorship. It's you just, you know, your ass got roasted in a review. So it's, and there's a difference between those two.
Yeah. I mean, this issue of cultural appropriation has become very big, and, you know, leads to questions like, you know, could someone else have written your novel? Could a non-Jamaican have written your novel? But this kind of weighs people down and intimidates people. And so, but you're saying that it's fear of a bad review rather than.
Well, you know, I mean, I was looking at some of the complaints that people who think they're being slammed for cultural appropriation make, and they're all complaints against reviews, sometimes by white men. I was like, I'm not the one calling, it's the white dude who's saying you didn't do this right. But so what? You know, we fail and we try again, and you write better, and you can't. I don't think you're allowed to get lazy anymore. And I think that can only be a good thing. I think you ultimately it's going to help you write better literature, I think.
Okay. Thank you. So we have some questions coming in already, and I would invite everyone to send in as many questions as you can. So this question is from Marlon. It says, rage is a constant feeling expressed by your characters in A Brief History. Where does that rage come from? It says, surprisingly...
Oh, rage. I thought you said reggae. No,
rage. I think there's reggae in there as well, but so no, rage.
Rage.
The coda to this is that, surprisingly, you seem very calm.
Well, yeah, I'm a middle-class kid from the suburbs. You know, I fight for me is Michael Jackson versus Prince. It's but I think, you know, I remember another version of this question when somebody asked me, what did it cost me emotionally to write my book? And I was like, I think it cost me some overdue library cards. You know, I don't, honestly, the day I realized this 10 years ago, that the stuff I wrote when I was seriously depressed and really, really despondent, dealing with serious depression, and the stuff I wrote when I was super happy was pretty much interchangeable. And that was a big shocker for me, because I always thought if I'm going to be super, super depressed, it's going to show in the work, and it really doesn't. So, you know, like when my students talk about, oh, I didn't write because I was kind of depressed, and I go, I know you think you're depressed, but you probably wasn't as depressed as Virginia Woolf. And she still wrote 15 plus books. So, you know, take your depression and get your ass to the desk and go write. So I really do believe in that thing about being a reporter for imagined people. I can't invest that way, because if I get invested that way, I'm not going to be true to it. I become involved in their story in a way that I don't want, because the characters are people, and I don't want to, it's not my story, it's theirs. So I do have to sort of, you know, keep my ass, especially when I'm writing stuff like violence. Because, funny enough, I'm actually pretty squeamish. I'm the person who will do this in the horror film. I know I write really horrible stuff and I can't deal with it. No, I think, as for rage, I think it's more complicated than that. These characters are not always rage-filled. They're sometimes bitter. They're sometimes actually having really funny moments. They're sometimes just laughing at the situation that, you know, that they're in. But yeah, it was, you know, a pretty angry time. But I think even anger has levels of dimension and contradiction to it.
Yeah. It's funny, I mean, you went through all this. Like, so before the Booker, you have to do all these panel discussions and presentations. And so I did one, and I was with all the other shortlisted people. And the woman who was moderating, I happened to pick me first, and she went, so why is your book so angry? And I went, I felt a certain kind of way. And it wasn't until later that I went, there's a book up here about this woman who absolutely hates her mother to death. There's a book up here about a serial killer who wipes out this whole family. There's another book about it, just chops this, you know, drags his body down to the basement. And I went, why is my book the angry book? You know what I mean? There's no violence in my book, really. You know what I mean? And it's like, but it's this thing of what people interpret as rage. Yeah. Like when, you know, who's allowed to express themselves in certain kind of ways, you know? And that's all I want to say about it, really, you know? And I was I'm not saying my book isn't angry, it might be, but it's like...
I get it's a very violent book. And I always say, you know, I think you're confusing preponderance with resonance. And
you're confusing
preponderance with resonance. And I give this really out there example of like Led Zeppelin 4. That Led Zeppelin are the kings of hard rock. They're the definitive standard of what loud music is. Led Zeppelin 4 is half folk music. A folk artist could do that, and you go, it's a folk album with some lively moments. It's the loud stuff, the heavy stuff reverberates through the album so hard that you think it's this non-stop hard rock record when there's stuff like Going to California on it. And I think that's, you know, for me, again, violence should be violent. The violence, all right, should reverberate. These things cost. You know, somebody dies, that person was somebody's mom, somebody's sister, somebody's whatever. And I think that's something that I wanted it to stay in. But I actually don't think it's that violent.
There's a question for Paul from Joselia. What can you tell us about the anthology, Hokum, an anthology of African-American humor?
Yeah, I put the wrong cover on it. That's what I can say.
Lesson learned.
It's a great cover, but I should have chosen something else. It's a beautiful cover, but it's something I should have done, like something that was all mine, not with other people in it. But that's a good question. So I think the impetus to do it was, there's a book called Oreo by a woman named Fran Ross.
Yeah, they reissued it last year.
What's that?
They reissued it last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't read that book until I was like in my mid-30s, late 30s or something, and had been written in the early 70s, 71, 72. And I read this book, and it's brilliant. And I was like, man, how has it that I've never come across this book? You know, and you know, I can't say exactly why, but I think part of it is it just doesn't fit into these easy categories of what people should be writing about. And it's different. But it got me to think about, like, what are the presumed tenors of, you know, African American literature? Why haven't I found them? You know, all these kind of things. You know, I was reading these Chester Himes autobiographies at the time, and then, so I just was like, yeah, no one talks about black humor in this literary sense, even though there's some of it out there. It's not a ton, because again, I think it's about expectation sometimes, not just about the industry, but from the writers themselves, about what you can and cannot do, or what you should and shouldn't be doing, I think. And so I just, you know, tried to put together this anthology of humor that was literary, but there's Malcolm X speeches, Sojourner Truth, Mike Tyson, you know, there's all kind of stuff in there that I think people think is rageful, but, you know, for me it's like really funny, you know, but I think it can be a hard distinction to see.
Is there, so could you do the same with Jamaican humor? Is there?
There is, and there are actually quite a few jokes in Brief History that only Jamaicans will get. Some of which I can remember right now. Again, because you know, we love to laugh. We laugh at a lot of things. And as I said before, a lot of situations we either laugh or we cry. So there is a lot of that. There's such an absurdity to living in the Caribbean. It's like, you know, when people's asking Gabriel Garcia Marquez about the Caribbean, and he's like, you know, the reality of the Caribbean eclipses the wildest fiction. That's why he objected to the term magical realism. It was like, this is Caribbean. We are that crazy, and things are that wild. And I have personally seen it rain frogs. So it's something that has always been, I think, an essential part of the Jamaican and the Caribbean character. Because if you're gonna respond to hardship, you don't have a lot of tools. So humor becomes a pretty essential one.
There's a question here for both of you about how the literary market has changed in the course of your lives as writers. Have things changed in terms of market since you became writers, and how do you see this market evolving 10 years from now? So maybe a big question there, but
I don't know if it's changed that much.
No, really.
You know, I mean, until I became prize-winning black dude, I don't know if it was, you know, it was, I guess, one of these sort of, you know, respectable literary authors. I think, you know, I think that the book in the publishing industry, certainly in the States, still think they have a clue what's going on, and I don't think they do. I think that's why they're always blindsided. 10, 15 years ago, they were blindsided by The Lovely Bones. How did this book become a hit? And of course, the response is that we had a whole plethora of dead and freaky children, even in films with Sixth Sense. You know, it was interesting that nobody realized that girl who plagiarized all these romance authors for a book, How Opal Mather Got Kissed and Got a Life, and nobody realized it. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I think the smarter publishers don't look at it that way. They look at, this is a book that people should read, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get people to read it. And I don't think they think in terms of where are trends going. Lots of publishers do that. I remember I was at a book fair, and I'm always interested in YA. I don't write young adult, but I'm really curious about it. And she came to me and go, angels, that's what's going to be next year, angels.
Angels.
Turns out it was children with terminal illnesses, so no. Nobody gave a damn about angels. It's just, we are obsessed with the future because we think we can quantify it and qualify it. And yeah, there are lots of formula fiction out there. Why not? I'm a big reader of a lot of them. But I think it's this sort of it's this sort of kind of Britney Spears attitude to literature, I think. It's like, if this sold 10 million copies, let's do 4 more of these.
I think Marlon is, you know, dead on. But I guess maybe one thing is, and this could just be my awareness, is I think independent publishing is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think it's really important, you know. And I mean, we can testify, you know, both being on one world, and,
right.
you know, and I don't know, maybe it's different in Europe, I don't really know. But I think of presses like Akashic or something.
Yeah,
and
Akashic and Grey Wolf.
Yeah, Grey Wolf. Yeah, and who are, so they're publishing great books, and I think the books are doing well.
Yeah.
But those books still don't win the major awards. Like, I mean, all the major awards, at least in the States, still come from the big houses.
Yeah.
But still, those books have really, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's, at least my perception of that has changed,
Yeah.
you know?
You know, despite how I sounded before, I'm not despondent or bitter about industry at all. I actually think it's a great time. Because even the successful writers like myself or Paul or so on, that I've never bought into this, it's just this kind of hell where everybody's looking for the next Jonathan Franzen. I've just never bought into that. I think there are a lot of people sipping cocktails in New York parties wondering why nobody's reading their book. But that's probably because they wrote a dull-ass book. But I actually think there are too many interesting things happening. There are too many positive things happening. Poetry books are hitting the top 10 on the bestseller list. That is a big deal. Claudia Rankine Citizen sold more than most novels. That is, you know, it's a big deal. I think my problem sometimes with the publishing industry is I think they underestimate their own audience. And the great thing about independent publishers is that they can't afford to do that. You know, they have to think, I can build an audience for this from this person, and I'll do the work. This is why they're, you know, making such great inroads now.
The title of our event is The Great American Novel. Marlon, you've written about this before. I mean, this is a notion that weighs very heavily on all American authors. Is it time to get rid of this idea? Is it achievable? Is it desirable?
You know what you're talking about, but, you know.
I hope we get rid of it before people start saying the great Swedish novel. Or because the Irish are already saying the great Irish novel, and it's very disappointing. I think it's, you know, I wrote an article about this. I said, you know, the great American novel reflects the great American neuroses, and which plays itself out in this great American inferiority complex, which itself plays itself out in this great American exceptionalism. It's like, dude, accept your penis size already. It's this continuing, this idea that there is this sort of definitive book, and there can never be. You know, that book. To me, the closest a book ever came to being a great American novel is American Tabloid by James Ellroy. Because I think he is the only, was at least at that point, the only writer who knows the American dream is a nightmare for everybody else. And I think that is an attempt to make a capital B big statement. But it's still, it's such a ludicrous idea. It can be fun, but I think it's ultimately just a ludicrous thing.
Yeah, I haven't even heard the term until I saw it for this, like in 15 years. So you might have resurrected it. It might be your fault.
Well, no,
it's your fault.
Not personally, no.
No.
It's very difficult nowadays not to talk about politics. You're both living in the US. You're writing and working in the US. It's impossible to escape this sort of clouds of...
I try very hard, though.
Yeah.
When
I mean, what's your reading as people interested in the arts and in storytelling and telling stories about this country you both live in? What's your take on politics at the moment?
You're definitely answering that one first.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think it's impossible to be divorced from the times you're in. I mean, that's impossible. So what the impact of that is could be anything. And I think things that go along with that, can go along with that. You know, let's just talk about Trump. I guess that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, with that is thankfully there's a, you know, a swelling of movement against, you know, people battling against something, different things on different parts. But sometimes that does create this notion of we don't have time for art, or we don't have time for humor, or everything has to serve this purpose. You know, but that's just a small little thing. But it's none of that's preventative, you know? You know, that might have an impact. But I don't think that necessarily changes what people are doing, you know? I think it gives some people some purpose. Yeah, you know what? I have something to write against. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, and they're allowed to go, you know what? We don't have time for that, but the person who they're talking about goes, all right, but I have time for myself, you know? And so I don't know. I'd have a hard time, you know, yeah, I don't know. Go.
You know, I'm always very suspicious of writers who are on a mission. I've always been very suspicious of it. One, they tend to make terrible art. And also feel that there is you get the exception because I'm writing about society and I'm writing, this is necessary. I was like, yeah, but it's also crap. I think the idea, and one of the things that you find, funny enough, on both sides, is this idea that the times as they are means the first thing we should ditch is art. The first thing we should ditch is writing and poetry and so on, because we have serious things to talk about. Well, you know, novelists are the only people making sense of the world. Without us, you're not going to have that. But I also think if you, whatever side you're on, if you make this decision, no more art, no more poetry, no more this, then they already won. You know, the whole point is to take away art, to take away civil society. If you are convinced you no longer need it, then I don't have to go through the trouble of taking it from you. You're already giving it, you know, giving it up. And I think we have to be, that's one of the things we have to be vigilant about, that we don't allow these things that define us, really, to go, and we allow it to go because we feel there's a greater mission. And yeah, I know a lot of very politically active and deeply involved activists, and I respect them. I don't try to be an activist. They don't try to be a novelist. And you know, I mean, I have a pretty politically aware Facebook page. I get in fights every week. But at the same time, I still reserve the right to write about witches and fairies and not leaving a subtext that somehow speaks about Trump.
Can I say one little thing? I remember, like, I think the first time I heard people talking about this, which I guess was right after Trump a little bit. And then, you know, I'm very slow, but, you know, after I heard whatever I heard, I thought about Guernica, you know? And this is Picasso in the middle of this moment, you know, who did this beautiful piece of work that does a lot of work, you know, but that's one thing. But then there's, at the same time, I'm no art historian, but I'm sure there's some non-political, non-agenda-driven art that's, you know, powerful in its way. And so, I mean, there's always this, it's always going to be good and bad art, you know? It doesn't fucking matter who's where, you know? That's always going to be the case.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to bring our discussion to an end. So, Paul and Marlon, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Dude.